Hello, everybody. It is Monday, April 20th, 2020, 4/20/2020. Welcome to Heady, Vermont's 420 edition of Mental Health Monday. I'm Kathy Blume, and I will be soon joined by psychotherapist and resident husband, Mark Nash. Happy 420 to you all, confinement or otherwise. Now, we know that you might just want to spend the day getting baked and watching Scooby-Doo reruns, which is totally fine. Mark and I watched, what did we watch last night? We watched The Incredibles, which is another great thing to watch baked. But if you're looking for a little more engagement, today at 3 o'clock, Heady, Vermont is doing a Zoom webinar called, that we're calling The Emperor Doesn't Wear Pants Anymore. It's an interview with Dan Herrera, who is the son of legendary cannabis activist and author Jack Herrera. For those of you who don't know, in 1985, Jack published The Emperor Wears No Clothes, which is where the Zoom title came from. And Emperor is now a classic in the cannabis world, and it extols and articulates the medicinal and industrial qualities of cannabis in all its various forms. Jack's son Dan, who we'll be talking to, is an industrial hemp developer, a hemp entrepreneur, and the director of the California-based Jack Herrera Foundation. Dan will be joined by a guy named Bruce Michael Dietzen, who designs carbon-negative hemp-based materials and products to help the industrial sector go green. Dietzen has a famous hemp car, which was seen on Jay Leno's garage, and he delivers a powerful message that basically hemp will save the planet, which is something we definitely have to get into. Our chat with Dan and Bruce will be followed up by a short set from Vermont singer-songwriter and cannabis fan Julie Wynn, and then we will send everyone over to a virtual 420 smoke sesh hosted by Meredith Mann of BTV Local 420, and the links for all of that are posted here. Here in Vermont, we are still staying home, although Governor Scott is talking about opening up the economic spigot, perhaps a quarter turn, and public outcry seems to have postponed the closure of some of the state-run universities, which is a huge economic deal, particularly up in the more rural parts of the state where they're incredibly dependent on the institutions of higher education for education and economic support. Okay, so now let's talk mental health. I will invite in Mark Nash, psychotherapist.
Where's my applause track?
Woo, yay, Mark. And I thought what we would talk about today is, come a little closer, fear of death, because I think that's at the heart of a lot of what we're all dealing with right now. Of course, we don't want our loved ones to die, we don't want to die ourselves, and the invisibility of the threat that we're facing makes the anxiety around catching something potentially lethal that much more potent. And I know personally, like I've said before, I had a major medical issue a few years ago where I almost died, and there's a part of me that was sort of sad, that would have been, oddly enough, would have been sad to die while I was unconscious because I wouldn't want to miss it. It feels like an incredibly interesting, if not arduous experience, and yet at the same time, definitely don't want to die. And there's a part of me which feels that much more, having been through that, much more vulnerable in the coronavirus situation. And while I don't have any of the actual prevailing conditions that would make me high risk, on an emotional level, and physically I don't feel as robust as I used to, which makes me worry about getting sick a little bit more than I might ordinarily. And also I find there is fear of death. There's fear of me dying. There's fear of you dying. There's fear of the people that we care about dying. And that death is one of those things that I don't feel like I have a particularly well-developed framework for thinking about. Oddly enough, when my mother died, I was there in the room, and it was both an intense and actually kind of beautiful experience, and yet that doesn't seem to help much at all in terms of that sense of vanishing from the world, both me and the people that I care about. And so I wanted to open this up to you because you, in particular, from a professional perspective, have things to say about it, but as an individual, you don't tend to worry about that too much.
No.
And so I thought it would be great for you to enter into this conversation.
Well, okay. So when you say you're afraid of death, what are you afraid of? Not being here.
Yeah.
You won't know.
But there's something about contemplating not being here, which is disturbing, disorienting, certainly not wanting to suffer on the way out the door.
Yeah, physical pain.
I think that's definitely a piece of it. And with COVID in particular, the inability to breathe, people having to be intubated, that's all, I think, a pretty rugged process.
Well, a spiritual leader that I listened to once said, are you afraid of death or are you afraid of the process of dying?
Well, I think both, actually.
Because what you're articulating is the process of dying.
Yeah, which...
The being dead part.
But it's... being dead feels like an affront.
You belong here.
Well, you know, like, you don't want to miss out. You don't want to leave the people that you care about.
The same thing as when a party's over. Right?
Kinda, yeah. And the sense of all the stuff that, and fear of missing out in a way. It's like all the stuff that's going to happen, good or bad, that I might not want to miss.
Yeah, it's going to happen though.
Yeah.
What are you going to do?
Okay, so you can say that. And still there's the sort of emotional, existential reaction to the notion of death that is intense, and you can't just sort of joke your way out of that.
Well, when I say what are you afraid of, what I think that people are usually afraid of when it comes to fear of death is fear of change. And the Buddhists talk about, you know, their first noble truth is life is suffering. What they mean is, they don't mean that your life's going to suck every single day without end. They mean that life is always changing, and so we are always being confronted with loss. And we don't like loss.
Right.
Loss is often painful. And so when we say we're afraid of death, maybe what we're really saying is we're afraid of change, we're afraid of loss, and maybe what we're really saying is we're afraid of pain. And so a lot of
the physical pain of suffering and illness, but the emotional pain also of loss, of missing people, of missing out, of, or, you know, one of my fears of you dying is my life becomes diminished.
And I
live in a cardboard box and I work in a bank. I don't, whatever it might be.
And what is true is your life becomes different. And you have an idea that you won't like that difference. And we can get used to pretty much anything. We have preferences about which we would prefer, but ultimately when we have no choice in the matter, we start to manage our feelings around whatever our current situation is.
But we also imagine there's some kind of like biological imperative to survive that is going to sort of take over whatever rational ideas we might have about it. Like I can go, oh yeah, that's right. So I can work through pain and then I won't be here and I won't know anything. Or if you die, I will be sad and I'll miss you, but life will go on. But there's also kind of like that biological urge to survive that makes me feel like it when confronted with my own mortality, would kind of take over and get really kind of, I don't know, aggressive or fearful or non-rational in the face of all of that.
Well, exactly, and that's sort of the core work of a lot of the therapy that I do, which is bringing the rational mind to bear under extreme emotional situations. You know, we've got the amygdala, which is our emotional brain, which tends to want to run the show. It's a lot older, and it's there for our survival.
When you say it's a lot older, what do you mean?
It's been part of our biology from, we call it lizard brain.
So from an evolutionary perspective, it was there in the brain long before the prefrontal cortex stuff. Okay.
That's right.
And define the amygdala a little bit more.
Well, I can't get too sciencey on you.
Right, but
I'm not a doctor. It's a little chunk of the brain somewhere back here that's the center of our emotions. Primarily, the biggest emotion that lives there is anxiety. fear.
So in a situation like a global pandemic, our amygdalas are probably being triggered all over the place.
Firing off constantly. And so then we have to bring our rational mind, our prefrontal cortex, to bear and say, okay, what are the actual fears that I have? Fear of dying. I might get sick. Okay, how likely is that? Am I doing everything that I can to keep that from happening? And when you confront the emotional catastrophizing with the rational mind, it starts to calm down the emotional reactivity. And so when you talk about being confronted with that existential dread, then you do exactly what you described, which is, all right, so let's look at it from a rational perspective and to some extent from a spiritual perspective. And that's why spirituality showed up, is to help us with our fear of death, because it suggests that there is something about death that we do not need to fear.
And what would that be?
Well, it depends on your spiritual teachings. Christianity suggests that if we're good with God, then we have nothing to fear because we'll be going to a better place. I don't know what Islam has to say about it. What does Judaism have to say about it?
Judaism doesn't say much, actually. There's sort of the idea of sort of uniting with the eternal flame of God. There doesn't seem to be a lot of, as far as I've been able to tell, a lot of distinction between who gets to join God.
Right.
It's not, I don't think there's a lot of separating out of the good and the bad.
But you get to join God.
Yeah.
So that's not so bad.
Yeah, right.
Maybe.
But if you are not a believer of a particular religious faith,
Mm-hmm.
I know from a more earth-based perspective, there are people who feel like, well, my atoms and molecules were created in the stars and they're a part of the world, and hopefully if I don't get embalmed, they'll just go back to everything.
Mm-hmm.
But there's the ego piece, the ego death, which I think is the hardest thing to contend with.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes beyond a rational place of, oh my God, I'm not going to be here anymore. That's just not okay.
Right.
And so how does the practice of mindfulness contend with something that primal?
It comes to, you have to reach a place somehow of accepting the inevitable. It's going to happen. And again, spiritual practice may help you get there. And so what I wanted to then segue into was Buddhists suggest that consciousness is eternal. Ego is a temporary shape that the consciousness takes in this body, in this lifetime. But there is a sort of a consciousness stream that exists that you dip back into and out of as you live and die.
You sort of individuate out of, have your human form,
Yeah.
your ego, your personality, but that what's filling that wave is just the consciousness that permeates the universe.
Yeah, exactly. And so coming and going isn't that big a deal. And so I had a personal experience of this when I tried an hallucinogenic. I tried LSD recently, and I've had tastes of this using psilocybin mushrooms as well. And the experience of being in that psychedelic space was an experience of connecting with pure consciousness. And pure consciousness took the form of love. And incidentally, it seemed to have a very feminine energy in my experience. And so I had relatively little fear or concern about death before that. And afterwards, it felt like there's really very little difference between being dead and being alive if you are in touch with a higher sense of consciousness.
So in the sort of moving into that consciousness space in the beginning part of your trip,
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel a sense of ego dissolution?
Mm-hmm.
And was it a scary or uncomfortable thing?
For me, it was a relief because it's something
Yeah, I don't
that
want to be me anymore.
yeah, it was like my ego is working really hard to know things and to be right and to be in control. I don't know most things. I don't.
And you know a lot of things.
And I know a lot of
compared
things.
to a lot of people.
But
Star Trek trivia, unbelievable.
and needing to be right is a huge burden, and trying to be in control of a universe over which I have zero control. I have a reasonable amount of control over my own behavior, and that's about it. Certainly no control over my feelings, moderate amount of control over my own thoughts.
Don't
but
have a lot of control over me, that's for sure.
zero control over you, zero control over anyone else's thoughts or feelings or behaviors.
Not the cats.
Not the cats, not the COVID. And so, sort of, it's a feeling of letting go, of freedom, of release, of you're just being, and that's an incredibly comfortable place. It helps that that's something that I've been working towards in my meditation practice for 20 or 30 years. And most of the time when I'm not high on psychedelics, I'm still struggling with those desires to control, cravings, graspings, aversions, all of those things that my ego tells me this is good, this is bad, this is better, this is worse.
And it's all of vital importance.
And it's all of vital importance, and if I can't have things the way I want them, then life sucks. That means that your life's going to suck a lot of the time unless you get used to accepting things as they are.
So,
including death.
Including death. So in a moment where we're afraid of losing our income, afraid of losing our home, maybe afraid of losing people around us, part of what you're saying is sooner or later that's going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
And it sounds to me like you have a different perspective on the notion of a timely versus an untimely death.
Yeah, I mean, for me it doesn't really matter when it happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to happen. Now, when you mentioned losing your job, losing your home, losing your source of income, I don't want to dismiss the incredible pain that will come with that. I'm not looking forward to you dying. That's going to be painful to me. Just because I accept it doesn't mean that it's not going to hurt. But it also means that as I experience the pain, I will move through it and find a way of being in the world without you, or without my home, or without my job, and work to make peace with that, as opposed to assuming that if I lose any of these things, that means that my life from that point on is unbearable.
So let's dig into the notion of acceptance a little bit more. So you're talking about it not as a
this is fine,
letting life roll over you.
Right.
It's more.
No, we still get to make choices.
It's more an acknowledgement that this is current reality.
Right.
Regardless of what we might want.
Yes.
Regardless of what we might have been hoping for.
Yes.
Regardless of what we might love to keep around with us.
Mm-hmm.
Current reality says this is what's happening.
Yep.
And so there's pain. It sounds like part of what you're saying is the suffering comes from a rejection of what is actually happening in the moment.
Yeah, the amount of suffering we experience is directly related to the amount we wish things were different than they are. Once we accept things as they are, as painful as they are, it gets easier to move through that pain.
In a political context, let's say, we don't like the president, perhaps. We see people engaging in behaviors that we disagree with, that we find destructive or run up against our values. So part of what you're saying, it sounds like, is we can acknowledge that that's current reality.
And we can work to elevate our values above those values we disagree with.
So accepting current reality doesn't mean just saying, all right, have at it.
No.
Go let life be what you're going to be. You can work in opposition to something. You can take action to try to improve things, but you're not going to be in the place of it shouldn't be this way.
Right.
Why is it this way? This is wrong.
Right.
Or you may think that it's wrong, but that somehow, if you had only done things differently, you would have had a different outcome.
Right. I can have extreme disagreement with our current administration, but that's the administration that we've got. I will fight as hard as I can to bring another administration in, but until then, I'm not going to spend an extra amount of my energy being wrapped up in anger and hate and discouragement.
And it shouldn't be this way.
It shouldn't be this. What the hell's wrong with the world that it's this way? It's just, okay, this is what we have to work with. Now let's just get to work with it.
It kind of goes back to the trope of life is messy.
Yeah.
Life is always going to be messy. There are always going to be moments or epochs of injustice, unfairness, pain.
Yeah. What's the quote from Gandalf and Frodo?
Oh, right. Frodo says, "I wish the ring had never come to me," and Gandalf says, "So do all who live to see such times, but that's not for them to decide. Well, all we can do is choose what to do with the time that's given to us."
Exactly.
So we could find ourselves living in a Balinese Valhalla. We could find ourselves living in Nazi Germany. We could find ourselves living in a Balinese Valhalla, a Pacific island that's being inundated by rising sea levels. We could find ourselves living in a situation of extreme privilege or extreme dismay of one kind or another. And even though we feel like it shouldn't be that way, the reality is that it is.
And so what are you going to do?
So you work to improve your situation,
Yep.
but you're saying don't get caught up in the emotional angina of why, oh, why, oh, why.
Yes.
Why, oh, why, the answer is because.
Yep.
Okay. So
And why do we have to die? Because that's the way it works.
that's part of life.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
life and death, death and life.
Yep.
How do you respond to the political protests that are happening recently around folks who feel like that stay-at-home orders are an imposition on their freedoms, and they have politicized this pandemic to try to turn it into an us versus them kind of thing? It seems, and we've heard stories of there's protesters out there with guns and ire and being confronted by nurses who, God almighty, they're already working hard enough, and they're yelling at the nurses. That seems like that's one of those things which kind of gets under your skin. Why are these people acting this way? Why are they yelling at the nurses? Why should the nurses, who are already working way harder than they should be, having to confront these people? And it feels like a clusterfuck. What do you do when you're, and it's under your skin. It's like you don't even know what to do about it. So how do you respond to a moment like that? How do you work your way through to a place of personal sanity in the face of all of that?
Me personally, I try to understand the protester's perspective, and understanding is not the same as agreeing. Understanding is not the same as condoning. I simply see that they are fighting for something that they believe is important to them. The nurses are fighting for what they believe is important to them. I have a personal opinion about what the right side is, but I don't even want to get too attached to that because we can't know ultimately what the outcome of any of this is. And so I sort of watch it with a detached observational perspective, and especially because there's nothing that I can do in particular about that, and me getting worked up is not going to help the nurses. I need to keep on doing what is going to be best for the little corner of the earth that I have any influence on. which in my case is staying as centered and grounded and calm as possible, because then I can help the clients that I'm working with on a daily basis. And if I got worked up by every twist and turn that the news took every day, I'd be in a constant state of fury. The things are going to happen whether I'm furious or not.
Right. I think there's a piece too where it gets very easy to predict what we think is going to happen.
Yeah.
And something happens which we respond adversely to, and we feel like, all right, now it's all going to go to hell. And we forget that we don't know what's going to happen, and that any given event is going to have consequences we could never anticipate. And there's that great Buddhist parable about the farmer and his son, where the son gets...
Horse runs off,
Right.
Everybody says, oh, that's a terrible thing. Farmer says, we'll see. Then the horse comes back with a whole bunch of new horses. Oh, that's a wonderful thing. Well, we'll see. The son tries to break one of the horses and breaks his leg, and everybody says, that's terrible. And the farmer says, we'll see. And then the army comes to enlist the son, and the son's got a broken leg, and everybody says, that's wonderful. And well, we'll see.
Right.
To know that our idea of how things should go is the best way they should go is a level of certainty and maybe even arrogance that I'm not really comfortable with.
Plus the whole issue of we can't predict the future.
Right.
Okay. Well, we are running out of time. Thank you all for joining us today. Hi, everybody. Mark, thank you once again for your wisdom and perspective and the story of your acid trip, which is awesome. And join us at 3 o'clock here on the Heady Vermont Facebook page or on Zoom for the webinar with Dan Herrera. And if you have questions, feel free to email us, info@headyvermont.com. We have questions for Mark.
mark-vt@gmail.com.
And we hope you have a lovely afternoon. Thanks so much, everybody.